Mr. President, Madam First Lady, colleagues, good afternoon and welcome to this very special event organized by the Center for Africana Studies and held here at Perry Worldhouse. My name is Michael Weisberg, the Interim Faculty Director, and it's really a great pleasure to welcome all of you today, to be the first to welcome all of you today. One of our missions here at Perry Worldhouse is to foster international policy engagement within and beyond the Penn community and to shed light on the most pressing global issues. And at a year when more voters than ever before in history will head to the polls around the world, including, of course, in South Africa, we're really excited to have the opportunity to hear the views of former President Motlanthe on freedom and democracy. Thank you, Mr. President, for being here. And to formally welcome you, I'm going to ask my colleague and the director of the Center for Africana Studies, Professor Wale Adebowale, the Presidential Penn Compact Professor of Africana Studies, and he's a professor in Africana and also in the Department of Political Science. His research and teaching interests are in the broad area of the social mobilization of power and interests in Africa as manifested in and through ethnicity, nationalism, racial and urban formations, elites, state and civil society, the media, intellectual history, and social theory. He is the editor or co-editor of 10 books, including Elites in the Politics of Accountability in Africa and Democracy and Nigeria's Fourth Republic Governance, Political Economy, and Party Politics. Please help me welcome to the stage.
Good afternoon. Can I request that you please silence your phones in case you haven't done so yet? Mr. President, Mrs. Motlanthe, distinguished guests, on behalf of the Center for Africana Studies and our partners, Penn Global, Perry Worldhouse, and the Lauder Institute, I'm delighted to extend a warm welcome to all of you as we welcome the former President of South Africa, His Excellency President Motlanthe, to celebrate and reflect on 30 years of freedom and democracy in South Africa. Today's discussion is very important for several reasons, and none may be more important than reflecting on the challenges of a free South Africa. We have the opportunity today to hear from someone who dedicated his life to fighting against apartheid and various forms of injustices in South Africa's history, and later became the president of a free South Africa and later vice president. President Motlanthe was the third president of South Africa. He was president between September 25, 2008 and May 9, 2009, following the resignation of President Thabo Mbeki. Thereafter, he became deputy president under President Jacob Zuma in his first time in office from May 9, 2009 to May 26, 2014. Perhaps the only person in Africa, if not in world history, who became president first before becoming deputy president in a democracy. President Motlanthe was a key member of the African National Congress, an organization formed in 1912, initially as the South African Native National Congress. Several other leaders that many of you might have heard of, people like Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and Nelson Mandela were some of the leaders of the ANC Youth League that adopted a program of civil disobedience, strikes, and boycott in 1949, which happens to be the year of the birth of our distinguished guest. Their objective was to win full citizenship, redistribute land, gain trade union rights, and secure free and compulsory education for all children in South Africa. As this audience is probably aware, the apartheid regime responded with force, most infamously with the Sharpeville massacre of 1960 and the Soweto uprising in 1976. President Motlanthe joined the ranks of the freedom fighters and was sentenced to Robben Island for 10 years. He was released in 1987. Following his release, he was tasked with strengthening the trade union movement in South Africa. To this end, he worked for the National Union of Mine Workers, NUM, as a national coordinator responsible for education and was elected in 1994 as its general secretary. The National Union of Mine Workers was then the most powerful trade union in South Africa. Our special guest held several leadership positions in South Africa. In 1997, he succeeded Cyril Ramaphosa, the current president of South Africa, as the Secretary General of the ruling party, the African National Congress. He was re-elected Secretary General in 2002. In 2007, he became the Deputy President of the ANC, and in May 2008, he was elected a Member of Parliament, and in July of the same year, he became Minister in the Presidency. 2 months later, in September 2008, he was elected President by the Parliament of South Africa. Our special guest is widely respected in South Africa and across the globe for his leadership. He currently serves as the patron of the Motlanthe Foundation, which was established in 2014. The foundation's mission is to contribute to equitable and inclusive growth on the continent by facilitating sustainable access and programs for beneficiaries in dialogue, youth education, community development, and social cohesion. The foundation's motto is Dialogue Among Equals. In 2020, President Motlanthe was appointed as a special envoy of the African Union to Ethiopia and was appointed to lead the African Union Election Observers Mission for the Republic of Ghana's national elections. In 2021, he led the African Union Election Observers Mission to the Republic of the Gambia for the country's presidential election. In 2023, he led a delegation of observers for the elections in the Republic of Liberia. A South African journalist once described our special guest using his nickname, Nkuluwa, meaning elder or elder brother, in this way, and I quote, "There are a few in the ranks of the ANC who have a bad word to say about Nkuluwa. To them, he is the silent but strong force that exudes calm in a moment of panic, a man whose cool-headed outlook sees him through many a tough time. His is the voice of reason. He's an intellectual of note, a comrade whose door is always open. He possesses great wit, which he unleashes with a dry sense of humor. Nkuluwa is also a man of principles," unquote. There are not many people who are or who have been heads of state in recent years around the world who can be so described. And if you want to clap, I can wait for a moment. South Africa today has the largest economy in Africa by nominal GDP and is the world's largest producer of palladium, platinum, and chromium. While we understandably focus on the struggle for freedom and democracy, we cannot forget how important the resources that South Africa is endowed with are to the rest of the world. South Africa is the most industrialized, the most technologically advanced, and the most diversified economy in Africa. Yet, the country has enormous challenges, some of which we will discuss today. For instance, 30 years after the end of apartheid, many young and poor South Africans are raising questions about economic justice and the very idea of rainbow nation. However, many still hold on to the promise and the hope of the last stanza of the national anthem, which says, "Sounds the call to come together, and united we shall stand. Let us live and strive for freedom in South Africa, our land," unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our special lecturer for 2024, President Motlanthe, as he speaks to the team, 30 Years of Freedom and Democracy in South Africa.
Thank you very much, Professor Wale Adebani, for your warm words of welcome. I've had the dubious honor of listening to my obituary being read rather than an introduction, so thank you. The president of Penn, Professor Larry Jameson, Deputy Provost, Professor Beth Winkelstein, Director of the Center for Africana Studies, Professor Wale Adebani, distinguished faculty members, students, staff, and guests. First off, allow me to thank the Center for Africana Studies and the University of Pennsylvania for inviting and offering me the honor to address this important congregation and timely dialogue. Let me also use this moment to acknowledge the role and contribution of the University of Pennsylvania in the anti-apartheid struggle, which was part of a global movement against racial discrimination. Drawing on the theme of today's event, 30 years of racial democracy in South Africa, non-racial democracy in South Africa after the end of apartheid. The challenge of squeezing 30 years of democracy into a short half-hour talk can be very complicated, and one is bound to unintentionally omit many parts of the puzzle. There are as many interpretations of the last 30 years in South Africa as there are South Africans, and I appreciate this opportunity to share but a few with you. But in order for me to do justice to the topic, I suggest to first give a brief outline of the shared history of colonialism, slave practice, and racism in our two countries. Second, to give you a brief basis, the legal basis of racial segregation in the Union of South Africa. And third, the policy of apartheid. And fourth, the advent of constitutional democracy in South Africa. Fifth, the work of the independent high-level panel on the assessment of key legislation and the acceleration of fundamental change. And then the way forward and conclusion. The struggle for independence in South Africa, as well as the continent of Africa, and the struggle for equal rights that ensued through the civil rights movement in the United States of America coincided on matching timelines with concepts, truths, and doctrines that overlapped, informed, and influenced each other, and still do to this day. Shared accounts of lived experiences of oppression and key historical moments ricocheting across the Atlantic shaped the future of post-colonial Africa and laid foundations for a shift of the mind and stimulation of consciousness that echoed our aspirations for a free world. In 1776, the geopolitical interpretation of economist and philosopher Adam Smith referred to the importance of the discovery of America and that of a passage to the East Indies by the Cape of Good Hope as the two greatest, most important events recorded in the history of humankind. 190 years later, in his address to the student body of the University of Cape Town, Robert F. Kennedy in 1966 said the following, and I quote, "I come here because of my deep interest and affection for a land settled by the Dutch in the mid-17th century, then taken over by the British, and at last independent, a land in which the native inhabitants were at first subdued, but relations with whom remain a problem to this day, a land which defined itself on a hostile frontier, a land which has tamed rich natural resources through the energetic application of modern technology, a land which was once the importer of slaves and now must struggle to wipe out the last traces of that former bondage." Up to that point, everyone in the audience believed that he was referring to South Africa. But the following sentence clarified the point. He said, "I refer, of course, to the United States of America," close quote. Similarly, The Dutch landed on our shores in South Africa in the mid-17th century, and of course later the territory was taken over by the British and dispossessing indigenous inhabitants of their land. History records that Jan van Riebeeck of the Dutch East India Company arrived on the shores of Cape of Good Hope, accompanied by a garrison of about 100 soldiers with a mandate to establish a refreshment station. He found the place populated by the San and the Khoi peoples. And so the first question which arose was, on whose land was he to establish such a refreshment station? Thus, the first war of dispossession broke out almost immediately in 1657 to herald similar frontier wars that were to last for 200 years. The second question that arose was, whose labor was to till the land? Since soldiers are not usually trained to till the soil, slaves and indentured laborers had to be imported from Malaysia, Indonesia, India, Angola, Zanzibar, Madagascar, and many more other countries. Later, when the British annexed the Cape Colony, they offered refuge in the Cape to the French Huguenots who were being persecuted following the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in France, and encouraged these Huguenots to migrate to Cape and to till the land. And of course, we say today, thanks to that, South Africa is the greatest producer of wine on the continent of Africa. In 1910, the Union of South Africa was established as a parliamentary democracy to the exclusion of the Africans from the main body politic of the country. The following host of laws were meant to promote racial, social, and economic segregation. The Masters and Servants Act of 1856, the Mines and Works Act number 12 of 1911, which kept black people out of skilled occupations in the most significant sector of the economy at the time. The Natives Land Act number 27 of 1913, which gave 87% of the land to whites and reserved 13% for occupation by Africans. The Industrial Conciliation Act number 11 of 1924, introducing job reservation for whites, and the Natives Trust and Land Act number 18 of 1936, which stripped Africans of the qualified franchise they enjoyed within the Cape province. And of course, a host of past laws which served to restrict and control movement of African males. The pass had to be on your body from the age of 16, and the police had the right to stop you wherever and ask you to produce your pass. And if you produced it and it did not have a work seeker's permit, which was called a special, because the law had reduced all blacks to status of temporary sojourners in all the urban areas. And so you had to have a work seeker's permit, which stipulated that you are permitted to be in the magisterial area of Johannesburg, whilst under the employ of, and they include the name of your employer and details of your employer. And if you did not have that stamp in your pass, you would be arrested and brought before a magistrate, and the charge would be that you're a want work, not that you are unemployed or you're a job seeker, but you're a want work, you're a lumpen, in simple language. Because when we look at the rise of Africana capital, how the Afrikaners accumulated their capital, they used prison labor. So the past laws were used to basically get free labor for the rising nascent Africana capital. And these laws were the basis of racial segregation in South Africa. So the Nationalist Party, which had won the elections in 1948, then graduated this policy of racial segregation into apartheid. Apartheid, one word, with no specific dictionary meaning, changed the South African scene overnight and won the elections for the Nationalist Party. One word, three-syllabled, charged with emotional intensity, which suited the general temper of white South Africa. A one-word ideology, which unleashed the race monster of our age. It is against the backdrop of apartheid that the advent of a new dispensation held great promise with immense hope that inspired the transition from parliamentary to constitutional democracy in South Africa. Fast forward to 30 years ago, on the 27th April 1994 in South Africa, the majority of the population voted for the first time in their lives. It was a joyous occasion that reverberated throughout the world. The overarching vision for a free South Africa in 1994 was the inclusive notion of a united, democratic, non-racial, non-sexist, and prosperous country. This crystallized the objective of the liberation struggle and what should supersede apartheid rule. There was a recognition that our transition would be based on restorative justice and not punitive justice, in contrast to the Nuremberg process. To heal the wounds and divisions of the past, emphasis was on reconciliation to forge social cohesion through the mechanism of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The new Constitution of South Africa, which was finalized in 1996, denotes a decisive break with the past and sets out a future trajectory of values and principles from which to derive rights, privileges, benefits, duties, and responsibilities of shared citizenship. This ushered in constitutional democracy. The Bill of Rights enshrined in the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa is unique by virtue of its focus on the right to life, human dignity, equality, non-racialism, and freedom as first-generation rights. Perhaps citing an excerpt from the preamble of the South African Constitution may offer a deeper understanding into the symbolism of a fledgling democracy and its grand aspirations. And I quote, "We, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of the past, honor those who suffered for justice and freedom in our land, respect those who have worked to build and develop our country, and believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. We therefore, through our freely elected representatives, adopt this Constitution as the supreme law of the Republic, so as to heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. lay the foundations for a democratic and open society in which the government is based on the will of the people and every citizen is equally protected by the law. Improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person and build a united and democratic South Africa able to take its rightful place as a sovereign state in the family of nations, close quote. Today, as we speak, freedom and democracy have indeed been achieved, but this only symbolizes a triumph over oppression and apartheid, which is effectively just half of the story. The other half tells a story of accumulated historical disabilities ensuing from many decades of apartheid rule. We learn history to know and understand the story of human development through the ages, the various forms of social organization, and the causes of the rise and fall of those forms of human relationships. So, accordingly, history is only as good as it elevates us to an understanding of where we come from, where we are, and what we can bequeath to posterity. It therefore gives us context. In December 2015, the Speakers Forum, as the representative body of South African legislative sector, moved to establish an independent high-level panel to undertake the task of assessing the content and implementation of legislation passed since 1994 in relation to its effectiveness and possible unintended consequences. For 21 months, the high-level panel on the assessment of key legislation and the acceleration of fundamental change, which it was my honor to chair, had crisscrossed the country to hear firsthand from those who lived in the Republic of South Africa about their experience of the laws passed by the democratic state. The panel's mandate was to review legislation, assess implementation, identify gaps, and propose action steps which, once identified, the laws that may require to be strengthened or being amended or changed. In other words, this intervention involves the identification of existing legislation that enabled transformational agenda and pursuit of the developmental state, as well as laws that impede this goal. The cardinal question was whether the legislative output of the post-apartheid state had been equal to the challenges already entrenched in society. The evidence presented showed that the ills of the past were being reproduced in post-apartheid society despite extensive legislative reform. The observed changes had not dented the deep inequities in the quality of services received in many instances, nor had they made fundamental shifts in outcomes as seen in evidence presented in the report. Thus, in some areas, society appeared to be progressively realizing the inclusive vision of the Constitution, while in others, there was a need to accelerate fundamental change. Legislation can have both positive and negative impacts on people's lives, as we know from the legislative history of colonialism and apartheid cited above. Without economic redress, there is a growing tension and turbulence between our constitutional democracy and a population suffering the triple threat of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. The promises of 1994 political settlement have yet to significantly improve the conditions of the majority of South Africans. In other words, most black people in South Africa still live in poverty. White people in South Africa still hold the lion's share of all forms of capital, and the concentration of wealth is still along the lines of old patterns of apartheid and colonialism. There is a mismatch between the education system of South Africa and the skills that are required by the economy, and this leads to high levels of unemployment even among young people who hold tertiary qualifications. Although the country has made great strides in providing universal education, basic health care, extensive welfare grants, and strong labor laws, these provisions have not remedied the inequality gap. Therefore, the gains that were celebrated confronted a challenge as these gains slowed down precipitously and service delivery began to flounder. Corruption crept in and the politics of patronage took over, draining the energy and the objectives of freedom. And we came to understand that the frontline soldiers and harbingers of malfeasance and corruption are usually the gifts offered to public servants and public representatives. We have had jobless economic growth based on commodity price boom, as well as investments in the money market and financial sector, instead of investing in the manufacturing and the productive sector of the economy. Land dispossession remains a source of national grievance for the majority of South Africans. Given a chance to review the crises that South Africa still faces today, we must work towards identifying catalytic projects and opportunities that may deliver equitable and inclusive growth to all. For example, investing in tourism and local economies of the leisure sector may increase job creation in tourist services, such as restaurants and hotels, in the construction of tourist accommodations and attractions, and local infrastructure in tourist centers. Tourism is therefore a catalytic sector that may offer countless opportunities for government to narrow down their focus and concentrate on certain issues that need attention. The ripple effect of this has the ability to also empower municipalities by investing in their local government capacity to enable local economic development and inclusive growth, as well as retaining human capital at such tourist destinations that mainly lie outside the urban areas, in order to reduce urban migration into the major cities. Another low-hanging fruit would be the local beneficiation of precious metals, thus creating jobs in South Africa. And in conclusion, the pillars of democracy, albeit not delivering the material benefits as expected, have remained strong, attesting to the strength of the Constitution. Multi-party democracy, for whatever it is worth, has continued to bloom and blossom. And so, whereas in 1994 there were only 20 political parties contesting elections, today we are informed by the Independent Electoral Commission that there are 150 parties plus independent candidates contesting this year's elections, which means the ballot paper will be quite bulky. And therefore, political parties who conduct political voter education will have to know the precise page in which they appear, so that they can direct their support base to go directly to that page. But this is the sign of the times, a reflection of a young but robust democracy, we have to go through this stage for our democracy to mature. So the fight for democracy was characterized by a prolonged struggle where for freedom, loss of limb and life were expected and often occurred. Such high levels of commitment are invoked with such energy and force to inspire today's activists who are stepping up to the plate, driven by both noble and selfish interests. Many of them who would say, why not me? Why must we vote for others and not me? So as I conclude, I want to leave you with the following thoughts. All progressive causes are inspired by love and not hatred. Love for land and liberty, love for humanity, and love for a sense of worth. Neither hatred nor revenge can contribute towards a humanely managed and sustainable world. And so we must all remember that before the invention of the mirror, the most handsome and beautiful human beings could only see beauty in others because they could not see themselves. And I would thank you for your kind attention. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, sir, for that very, very interesting, return to history, and then the way in which you brought that to the present, and the conclusion, which is quite thought-provoking. I would want to start on a note, something that I mentioned in my introduction, which I find quite intriguing, about how it feels to have been president and then to be deputy president. I asked that specifically because of, I was reflecting on John Nance Garner, who was vice president to President Franklin Roosevelt. He said that becoming vice president, and I quote him, was the worst damn fool mistake I ever made. So what was your own experience?
Well, the advantage of serving as a deputy president after having served as a president is that the president who you deputize is your successor. And so in many instances in our discussions, the president would say, look, no deputy president behaves the way you do. And I would say, well, you remember I was president before you. So no president behaves the way you do. So there's an advantage that you can come at issues from a position of experience. And but also it communicates a message that to be in public service means you accept to serve at whatever level. That's what is important in that experience here.
Yes, at the end of apartheid 3 decades ago, Africa, the black world and indeed the entire world expected so much from South Africa. The way in which apartheid ended seemed to represent a model for the rest of the world in terms of how to end, a crisis in a country that is, full of the kind of crisis that you had in South Africa. And that was a model of resolving, tensions and crises in the country. So, South Africa came up with a constitution that, was perhaps the most progressive in human history. Given the advantage, the position that you occupied in 1994, what were the expectations that you had of, South Africa, and how would you reflect on what the outcome has been in the last 3 decades?
Well, the struggle against apartheid was conducted under the Freedom Charter. In the mid-50s, 1955 to be precise, a Congress of the People was convened, which included the South African Indian Congress, the African National Congress, the South African Colored People's Congress, as well as the Congress of Democrats and the South African Congress of Trade Unions. The Nationalist Party itself was invited. All political parties were invited to participate. But instead of sending delegates, the Nationalist Party sent a posse of police to arrest those delegates who participated. Fortunately, by the time they disrupted the conference, the Freedom Charter had already been adopted by that conference. And so the Freedom Charter in its preamble states that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and that any government of the future must be based on the will of all the people. And so the central message of the Freedom Charter was that you fight against an evil system. You must not be like your oppressors. And that is why the apartheid system was one of white supremacy and racial discrimination. And so you couldn't posit against that black supremacy or African supremacy. You had to strive for an inclusive system, because in liberating ourselves as an oppressed people, we also had the responsibility to liberate the oppressors. And so we couldn't be like them. We had to be more accommodating, and because it's all about humanity, so we had to say we are all fellow human beings. You've treated us as subhumans, but we're not going to do that. So that's the promise of 1994. And of course, it's a process, it's a long journey that we have to work towards achieving over time, because we still find, as I said, the fault lines of apartheid are still in place. Legislation has changed. The rights are enjoyed by all, but that's the principle and what is enshrined in the Constitution. The reality and the lived experience is slightly different and needs a more determined effort to work at it. The younger generation who have not experienced apartheid, to whom apartheid is like a distant story from the misty beginnings of time, they have no patience. They don't understand. So they want the rights that they are entitled to be realized forthwith. And as a nation, we need that. You need young people to bring radical perspectives, because we ourselves have difficulties in explaining to people to be patient, to wait, and so on. People who have nothing. As Martin Luther King Jr., in his letter from jail in Alabama, says if you are fighting against the degenerating influence of nobodiness. If you are a nobody and you regard yourself as a nobody, it's very difficult for those of us who are privileged to say, please be patient. We have no such right. Yeah.
So to pick up on that, in my research on street redeeming in South Africa, met young people in townships and informal settlements, and they've expressed this, sentiment. I remember the first time, some young people in Orange Farm first told me Mandela was a sellout. I was shocked. I was like, Mandela? And, your generation, they think that you've all sold out. Yeah. So what's the promise? What's the concrete promise that you have for them? Because they are absolutely frustrated with your generation. They think that it's not only that you sold out, but that you have no vision about, what to do about the conditions that, really devastate their lives. So what are the concrete things that need to be done to address the question, the challenges of this younger generation who are losing hope?
Well, it is the prerogative of youth to be radical. And that's what we expect from them. If you have a radical youth, you have a good problem. The worst problem is if you have a youth of wheelbarrows. So if you leave them here, you'll find them there after 20 years. That's the worst problem. Because progress and motion can benefit from that kind of radical perspective. And that is why we've got to try to understand their vocabulary, understand their anxieties, and impart to them that they also have a historical obligation to define what their role is today, and to say to them, you are not leaders of tomorrow, you are leaders today. Yeah.
Now, I'm also following up on that, and I think this is important because, especially your role, not just as former president, but as one of the leaders of the ruling party, South Africa faces incredible challenges now. State capacity has collapsed across many government functions that are essential to a functioning economy. There is extremely high inequality. Unemployment remains high at, I think, 35%. In fact, youth unemployment exceeds 60%. Yeah. There is unprecedented energy crisis with persistent electricity shortages. Poverty has risen to 55%. That's just so many challenges. In fact, a recent report says that South Africa has the world's highest inequality and unemployment rate. So what went wrong, and what is being done by the government of your party that is in power now to address these fundamental questions?
Well, as I said, as they say, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That adage is true even today. And we had jobless growth in the first decade of our democracy, mainly due to the commodity boom. And so the economy was growing at 4-5%, but mainly from the money market, not from the manufacturing and productive sector. And so people who invest in the money market are speculators. So they come in at a certain time and they leave. And when they leave, they don't bid you farewell. And hence, so the economy wasn't creating the jobs. And as I said, the education system was also not creating the hard skills needed by the economy. So it's a double whammy, if you like. And the corruption which took hold of first the governing party and therefore the public service as well set us back a great deal. Remember, that was preceded by an economy that was growing. We even hosted the FIFA World Cup in 2010. And then from then, things just went south because of corruption. Because corruption means that a bottle of water like this, which goes for $1 maybe, it's sold to government for $25 when there's an occasion like this. That's what corruption means, and it bleeds, scarce resources and diverts them. So that coupled with poor maintenance of bulk infrastructure meant that, let me give you an example. At Eskom, there are a number of coal-fired power stations. At this power station called Tutuga, which has 6 units, because of poor maintenance and also the centralization of procurement at Eskom head office. So when a unit needs a spare part, it takes forever for head office to procure the requisite spare part and send it through. And so what do? They carry on with the 5 that is operational. And if any one of the 5 also needs some maintenance or spare part, they then get the spare part from the one that's already in operational. And slowly, at the end, they end up with 2 functioning units. And the other 4, that's where you get your spare parts from. And so that reduces the base load. Yes, because you need balance in your base load. Otherwise, you're going to have forced, stops in order for you to repair. So that's what corruption led to. At the moment, there are efforts under President Ramaphosa to embark on a renewal process and take corrective measures. I mean, institutions established to support democracy were hollowed out through just, the processes of deliberately undermining their capacity, including revenue service. I mean, no governing party can reduce the capacity of the revenue service to collect revenue. You need that. Your budget comes from collected revenue. But even the South African revenue services were being hollowed out of capacity to collect the revenue. Yeah.
So you are the chair of the electoral committee for the ANC for the next elections. Many people believe that the ANC is intellectually and politically exhausted. And so they are wondering, why should they vote for a party that seems to be ideologically, intellectually, politically exhausted? And as you mentioned in your speech, that seems to be part of the reason why you have about 120 other parties now, because it seems that ANC is exhausted. So I'm wondering why you think that the party would be a good option for many people in the next election. And it seems evident from some of the things we have read that your majority would, if at all you still manage to have majority in the parliament, would really be drastically reduced, if at all you are even able to win the election. So the question is, why should a party that is ideologically, intellectually, and politically exhausted be allowed to return to stay in power?
Well, experience is the best teacher. So the African National Congress has experience of being, of course, eroded by corrupt elements. But that's an experience. From that in itself is an experience. The other parties don't have such experience. That is why at local government level where there are coalitions already, those coalitions are very unstable because they are not established on the basis of principles or common vision. They are transactional. So you have a plethora of smaller parties that say, what is in it for us? We will be with you, but what do we get in turn? So the national focus gets lost in that process. The ANC will remain central in the South African polity, precisely because of the experience it has over the years. And of course, a party that is 102 years old, of course, will get tired. And the tendency is that you can always celebrate your glorious past. But you know, one of our known poets in South Africa, Professor Kgalema Petrus Motlanthe, is no more, may his soul rest in peace. In one of his poems entitled, "The Present is a Dangerous Place to Live," he writes, past, present, future as one word. And he says, past, present, future is always now. So you need the experience. The past may be glorious, but it's of no value unless you draw the correct lessons out of the past to address the present in a manner that lays down a solid foundation for the future. So past, present, future is always now.
There have been recent reversals in the democratic progress in Africa. Mm-hmm. About 8 countries in West and Central Africa in the last few years have had experienced military takeover. So what's your take on the fate of democracy in the continent in light of these democratic reversals in some parts of the continent?
Well, democracy has a solid and bright future on the continent because it is only through democracy that the needs of the ordinary people would be addressed. So the coup d'etats have a lot to do with external influences. Because, many countries on the African continent still have to win the right to define what their strategic goals are themselves. Because at the moment, the rating agencies, the donor funders, are the ones who determine what should happen. So 55 countries on the continent are expected to do exactly the same things at the same time. And it's clear, one of the leading analysts on the continent, Professor Olukoshu Adibao, says we are going through a period of choiceless democracies on the continent. Choiceless because policy is externalized, is outsourced. And progressive, what would qualify for progressive policies gets punished by the investors. So there's still that challenge for the continent and each and every country to win the right to determine what its own strategic goal is, and to define their own problems.
You were once the patron of the International Just Day in South Africa. I know that you really are into jazz music a lot. I was wondering, who are your favorite jazz musicians?
Oh my God. Where, in South Africa or?
South Africa, around the world.
Well, there's a jazz musician here called Clifford Brown. He's a trumpeter. At the age of 20, he was involved in a near-fatal car accident and almost died. And recovered and played with some of the prominent jazz players and made lots of recordings, but died at the age of 25 in a car accident. So within that brief period, and he inspired other musicians, such as Sonny Rollins, because many jazz players fell victim to drug addiction. But Clifford Brown, young as he was, could go and perform. And when it's done, hang out with everybody else and then go home without being hooked on drugs at all. So he inspired people like Sonny Rollins, who said, look, Clifford Brown proved that it is possible to be a wonderful jazz musician and not be a victim of drugs. So he was one of my favorite, jazz trumpeters here. He died very young at the age of 25.
Any other?
Well, there's a whole lot of them. I mean, Max Roach,
Okay.
Those are great. Pharoah Sanders, John Coltrane, those are great musicians. But, from back home in South Africa, we had Hugh Masekela, Miriam Makeba, Jonas Gwangwa, Caiphas Semenya. And Caiphas tells me a wonderful story that, so in 1959 already, they produced the first jazz album called Jazz Epistle Verse 1 with Abdullah Ibrahim, Kipi Mwekezi, Jonas Gwangwa, Hugh Masekela, Makaya Nchoko. And so Miriam Makeba, who was helped by Trevor Huddleston and Harry Belafonte to come to the United States, then made an arrangement for Hugh to come to the United States. Hugh was 20 years old, and he got admitted at Manhattan School of Music. And we, back home, believed him to be one of the accomplished jazz musicians. So they tested him, and they found that he had a good ear for the music. He could follow what they were playing. And then they asked him, and what do you want to study? And so he says, no, I play trumpet. So they gave him a score sheet, and he couldn't read the music. He was self-taught, never studied staff notation. And then they said, okay, play, whatever you can play from the ear. So he then played, and they said, well, you have no idea about trumpet. The way you hold it, the trumpet, the way you put the mouthpiece to your lips, wrong. So anyway, we'll give you a chance. So they put him in a class with 13-year-olds. And Hugh says they played far much better than he ever hoped to play. So he spent 5 years there and qualified to become really, and could now read music, could compose and write music. And then the following year, he also, made arrangements for Jonas Gwangwa to join. Jonas Gwangwa was 22 years that year. So he gets admitted at the Manhattan School of Music, And they do the same, they test him, and they find that he's got an ear. He understands the music and so on. And they say, "Oh, so what instrument do you play?" He says, "I play trombone." So they say, "Okay, play it." So they give him a score sheet, and he couldn't read. Then they say, "Okay, play whatever you play." So he plays a slide trombone. And then, he goes down like that. So they ask him, "When you go down there, what note are you trying to reach there? Because you can play these notes from here." So same thing happens to him. They put him in a classroom with 13-year-olds, and he spent 5 years there and became a great musician. The third one to join them was Caiphas Minya. So Caiphas, of course, the two brief him and they say, "Man, don't try." He had also taught himself to play an alto saxophone. So they say, "Please," So when he gets there, they test him and they find that, he's got an ear and everything. And he has composed songs that were performed by Miriam Makeba and Hugh Masekela and the others. So they ask him, "So what do you want to study?" And he says he wants to do orchestration and composition. He's not interested in playing an instrument. So they say, "But you are 25 years, we can't take you." So they rejected him. Yeah, rejected him. And he was fortunate to find a professor who had 5 months in which to impart the basics of, understanding staff notation and being able to orchestrate the music and so on. And he became a prominent musician and composer, no less a musician like Quincy Jones described him as a griot, because when he was doing the score for Roots, he relied on Caiphas Minya. Yeah.
Thank you very much, sir. So we'll open it up to the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll identify you. Please mention your name and your affiliation. And then please ask a question. Don't give a brief lecture.
Okay. Good evening, former President of South Africa, Mr. Kgalema Motlanthe. My name is Omar, and I come from Mozambique, and I'm currently a graduate student studying international development. Given that the youth within the African continent compose more than 50%, in South Africa more than 1/3, I was wondering, in practical and specific terms, how would the youth actually collaborate with the older generation in order to build solutions that address the most pressing issues as a mechanism to build a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable South Africa? So be more than happy if you could elaborate on that. Thank you.
Okay. Let's take 2 more questions so the President can respond. Okay, you are already there? Yes.
Okay. Welcome, Mr. President, to University of Pennsylvania and also Philadelphia. My name is Dagmawi Wubshet. I'm a professor here at Penn in the English department. My question to you is, if you could, I'd be curious to hear you reflect on South Africa's decision to bring Israel against, the case against Israel before the ICJ, and did so with such urgency, moral clarity, and courage. And you reflected about, freedom and democracy within South Africa, but what this nascent democracy has to teach us at the world stage at this hour. Thank you.
Here, in front here, yes.
Hello, my name is Gabby. I'm a 4th-year undergraduate student from Johannesburg in the Huntsman program. My question is similarly related to South Africa's position on the global stage. Considering our involvement in organizations like BRICS, the African Union, and other multilateral organizations, what do you see as the future of South Africa as a leader, not only in Africa and on the continent, but also amongst many developing nations across the world?
Yes, you can answer this.
Oh,
set,
okay.
yes.
Thank you. All right. Well, I suppose the historical mission and obligation of the youth is to acquire education and skills. And armed with education and skills, they can solicit support from the older generation and as I said, bring about innovative ideas, radical ideas, because that's what would take the continent forward. But that's the first obligation. The historical mission of the youth is to acquire education and skills, because as I said, young people are not leaders of tomorrow. You lead today, because the best way, as senior, or people of advanced age, the best way we know of how to train young people is to give them responsibility. You must have responsibility, and we guide you. But we can't say, no, you are not ready, please wait your turn, and so on, because that way we are basically arguing that you are leaders of tomorrow. You are leaders today, and we give you responsibility. That's how we were trained. We're given heavy responsibilities by our forebears and elders, and sometimes you think, well, they throw me into the deep end here, but they guide you. They are there to guide you, and that's how I think the youth, has that obligation of playing a leading role. And as I said, as the older generation, our responsibility is to listen and hear your voice and understand your vocabulary. If we don't do that, then we become conservative. And it's easier to adapt to circumstances and to lose the will to continue striving to find improvements when you are older. Yeah, you just get tired. Yeah, so I think the youth, we need that energy of youth to take society forward. The question of the ICJ case against Israel. We come from a country where, like I said, like the United States, we had people coming to our shores from all over the world. In fact, the South African nation is like a microcosm of the United Nations. And so we've always adopted the approach and attitude that first and foremost we're South Africans, and that there's no advantage in transposing any situation anywhere in the world into South Africa. But whatever happens to people outside of South Africa matters to us. And we work very closely with the South African Jewish Board of Deputies. We work very closely with the South African Muslim Judicial Council. And our approach has always been that we are affected by what happens outside to different and varying degrees. However, we must strive as South Africans to respond as South Africans. And so the the case that was presented by South Africa was informed and inspired by our own national anthem. Our national anthem is a call for peace. And so any acts that undermine peace, we frown upon. But we do so in a manner which seeks to find solutions, not to manage the situation, but to find solutions. So, and I think in that regard, we are fortunate that there's resonance of feeling across many nations, including the American nation, that the notion of waging a war to end all wars is flawed. It's never worked. It has never worked. As I said, hatred and revenge cannot contribute positively towards a well-managed and humane world that we strive for and desire. The United Nations was established precisely to ensure that the wars of the past are not repeated. But of course, we are now at the brink of a third world war. I went through the battlefields in France, in places like Lille and so on, and where the First World War happened. You have to walk through those places. You have to see the graves to understand that young people, probably 19, 20, were sent to the slaughterhouse. From trenches with Germans positioned on an upper hill with machine guns, and they just mowed them down. Yeah. So we got to try and avoid any arming of society with weapons of mass destruction under the pretext that it's for self-defense. We got to try and get society to move away from that and value peace rather than war. And the world thought it had drawn sufficient lessons from the ravages of the First World War, only to go into a Second World War. And as I said, now we are on the brink of a Third World War. So war is never being the answer. War is never be the answer. Only peace. And remember, for economic progress, you need peace and stability, political stability. That's what the world needs. The world is in a polycrisis now. So that case should be understood within that context. That these are standards that the United Nations established itself. I went through Auschwitz outside Poland, and it's a harrowing experience. Harrowing experience, because there are 2 rooms full of human hair, because the Nazis were going to experiment on how to manufacture durable socks out of human hair. And in his book, William Manchester, there's a book called The Arms of Group, which explains fascism better than any other book I've read. Because those concentration camps were actually labor camps. And Jewish people were brought by train, in trains. So the camp is designed such that when it stops and people get off the train, there were medical doctors, Nazi medical doctors who were there to examine them. And as they examine them, the able-bodied ones go on the other side. And the infirm and aged and those who are too young to work, one side. And those are the ones who end up in the gas chambers. And the Germans were so meticulous that those who minister the gas have no contact with their victims. The gas chamber is designed like an ablution hall. These people would have traveled by train from wherever, from the ghettos, without having a bath. And so when they get there, the Germans mislead them that they are going for a bath. And they search for any valuable. If you had a golden tooth, a dentist would be there to extract it. And then you go into this ablution section. So those who minister this deadly gas do so from the chimney on the rooftop. They have no contact with the victims. And as people die and collapse, the ones who are not strong enough to serve as labor, but who are strong enough to pull corpses, are given that responsibility. And as they feed them into the furnaces, an orchestra, classical orchestra, is performing music. Now, I can't think of any more madness like that. But that's what, if you go through Auschwitz, that's what you experience. So, what did we learn from that harrowing experience? Did we learn lessons that enable us not to repeat, not to be like the Nazis, not to be like the fascists? That's the cardinal question. That's the cardinal question. And that is why South African jurists and government said, we must take this to the International Court of Justice, because it was established, the Convention against Genocide exists precisely for that. But of course, you see, there would be a reaction and a pushback. But that's how history is written, by the choices that people and governments make at a certain point. Yeah. Okay. Then, of course, South Africa has been part of what was called IPSA, India, Brazil, South Africa. And now South Africa is part of BRICS. And these blocks that exist today are not meant to divide the international community, but they are building blocks towards a more humane world community of nations. Now, just to give you a sense, you know, within BRICS, there's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. From the point of view of trade within BRICS, 96% of the trade with South Africa is covered by China and India. And only the remaining 4% is spread between Brazil and Russia. And outside of BRICS globally, the European Union is South Africa's largest trading partner, followed by the United States of America and China. So from the trading interests, South Africa has to maintain its relationship, cement them, strengthen them with the European Union, with the United States of America, with the BRICS partners, countries. It can be either this or that. The world cannot work like that. And that is why international relations have got to be strengthened and built throughout. From our own experience, we know that actually you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. Yes. Your friends are your friends. You don't abandon them. You rely on them, you work with them, but you also must understand that you must talk to those who are even antagonistic and hostile towards you. There's no point in being divisive in the world. It's always virtue and positive energy generated by engaging with all. And as I said, South African nation is a microcosm of the world. And so literally, when we hosted the FIFA World Cup of the 31, because South Africa was the 32nd, 31 countries that came to South Africa, all of them had support base from descendants of their own nationals. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I've just been informed by my minders that we've run out of time for further questions. So I will, on behalf of the Center for Africana Studies and our partners, Penn Global, Perry Waldhouse, and Lauder Institute, thank you very much for your excellent lecture and for visiting Penn. We hope that this is the start of a long-lasting relationship with you and more, to widen our relationship, the relationship of the center with South Africa. As you found out today, we have great faculty members from your country and some students, so we hope to strengthen the relationship. And on behalf of the center, I would like to present this gift to you, sir.
Oh, didn't I say? Thank you. Thank you. I did say the frontline soldiers of malfeasance and corruption are gifts. So I'm obliged to then declare it. I have to declare it.
Okay, sir.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Can you please get up and please, yes, thank you very much. Please wait as the president leaves. Yes.